Imagine waking up in a darkness so absolute you can't tell if your eyes are open or closed. The air you breathe is heavy, thick with the stench of waste, damp stone, and rotting flesh. You are standing waist deep in freezing, diseased water. Above you, the lords are feasting in the castle halls, but down here, in a hall called an oubliette, you have been forgotten. You aren't being punished to learn a lesson. You are being punished to rot until you're nothing but bones. Textbooks tell us prisons were for reflection. But in the Middle Ages, they were the slowest, most agonizing death sentences in human history. Today, we are descending into the darkest pits ever dug by man. I'll show you why many prisoners eventually begged for the executioner's blade, just to escape one more night. Before we descend deeper into this nightmare, subscribe to join our Guild of History Detectives. Let's uncover the truths they tried to bury. Let me ask you something before we start. When you imagine a medieval prison, what do you see? Dark stone walls, maybe some chains, a guard with a torch, a miserable guy in the corner waiting for trial. Pretty bad, right? Yeah, that image is way too kind. Because the first shocking truth I need to tell you is this. Medieval prisons were never meant to rehabilitate anyone. They weren't even meant to punish you long term. In many cases, they were designed to break you mentally so completely that death felt like a relief. And I'm not being dramatic. Medieval people literally prayed for death inside these places. Here's why. In the Middle Ages, prison wasn't a sentence. It was a holding pen. You weren't there to serve time. You were there to wait for ransom, for judgment, for confession, or for execution. And the waiting itself was the torture. Shocking fact, right away. Many medieval prisoners were never formally charged with a crime. You could be thrown into a dungeon because someone accused you, because you owed money, or because a local lord simply didn't like you. Evidence optional. Witnesses? Maybe your fate depended more on politics than truth. Now let's talk about the place itself. Medieval prisons weren't standardized buildings. Some were castle basements. Some were towers. Some were literally old storage rooms repurposed into cells. Ventilation was almost non-existent. Light came from a single slit in the wall, if you were lucky. In some prisons, prisoners never saw sunlight again. And here's a detail that always hits hard. Many cells had no doors, just holes. A prisoner would be lowered down into a pit, sometimes called a oubliette, which comes from the French word oublier, meaning to forget. Once you were in, the opening above might be sealed. No ladder, no stairs. Food, if it came at all, was dropped from above. Yes, some prisoners were literally forgotten to death. But even in normal cells, life was brutal. Floors were dirt or bare stone. No beds, no blankets. Straw was a luxury, and straw quickly became soaked with urine, feces, vomit, and blood. You slept on it anyway. because the stone beneath would steal your body heat and slowly kill you. Here's another shocking fact. Hypothermia killed prisoners even in summer. Stone walls stay cold year-round. Weak, underfed bodies couldn't generate enough heat. People froze to death without a single snowflake falling. Food. Let's talk about that. Medieval prisons didn't provide meals consistently. In many cities, prisoners were expected to pay for their own food. If you had money or family outside, you might survive. If you didn't, you starved slowly. Some prisons allowed begging through bars, others didn't. There are records of prisoners gnawing on leather shoes, belts, even bits of straw mixed with insects just to quiet the hunger. Shocking fact, starvation was considered legally acceptable. Authorities didn't see it as execution. If you died from hunger, that was your problem. Now imagine living like this while not knowing why you were there, or when it would end. Psychologically, medieval prisons were masterpieces of despair. There were no clocks, no calendars, no schedules. Time dissolved. Days blurred into nights. The only marker was the sound of guards or the screams of other prisoners. Confessions weren't always beaten out of people. Sometimes they were waited out. After weeks in darkness, silence, hunger, and filth, people confessed to crimes they didn't commit just to make it stop. Here's the part most people don't expect. Religion made it worse. You'd think prayer would bring comfort. Sometimes it did. But priests often told prisoners their suffering was God's will. That pain purified the soul. That endurance proved faith. Some prisoners genuinely believed that dying in prison meant salvation, especially if they confessed, guilty or not. So yes, people prayed for death, not because they wanted to die, but because death was the only exit they could imagine, and we're just getting started, because this was the best case scenario prison. Next, we're going to talk about who ended up in these places, including people who committed no crimes at all, and why women, children and debtors often had it worse than murderers. Trust me, the next chapter gets darker. Alright, now here's the part that usually shocks people the most. When we talk about medieval prisoners, most of us instinctively imagine criminals, thieves, murderers, violent, people who deserved to be locked up. That assumption makes the suffering easier to accept, right? Yeah, medieval prisons don't work that way. One of the most uncomfortable truths is this. Some of the worst prison conditions were reserved for people who hadn't committed any violent crime at all. In fact, if you had committed a serious crime, you sometimes had it better. Let me explain. In medieval society, prisons were not the main tool of justice. Punishment happened quickly and publicly. Executions, mutilations, fines, exile. Those were the real sentences. Prison was just the waiting room. And who waited the longest? Debtors, political enemies, religious dissidents, women without protection, children, and people who were simply inconvenient. Shocking fact, Debt was one of the most common reasons people were imprisoned. Not theft, not murder, debt. If you owed money and couldn't pay, the law didn't say, "Let's work out a payment plan." It said, "Let's lock you up until someone pays for you." Sometimes that someone never came. Here's the cruel logic. Medieval authorities believed that suffering pressured families to pay faster. If your husband, father, or son was rotting in a cell, maybe you'd sell land. Maybe you'd beg the church. Maybe you'd borrow at insane interest rates. And if you couldn't, well, that was considered your moral failure. Now imagine this. You're locked in a dungeon because you're poor. The longer you stay inside, the less likely you are to ever earn money again. The system traps you perfectly. Many debtors died in prison, not executed, not sentenced, just erased, and it gets worse. Women were especially vulnerable in medieval prisons. If a woman was accused of a crime, she didn't just face the law, she faced reputation annihilation. Female prisoners were often placed in the same facilities as men, with little to no protection. Abuse was common and complaints were meaningless. Shocking fact, pregnancy did not guarantee release. Some women gave birth inside cells. Infants died from cold, hunger, or disease. Others survived only to grow up inside prison walls. And children, yes, children went to prison. If your parent was imprisoned and no one could care for you, you might be locked up with them. If your family owed money, you could be held as leverage. If you were accused of theft at age 10, you could be treated like an adult. There was no concept of too young. Now let's talk about political. Prisoners, the people, medieval prisons, were really built for kings, nobles, bishops, and city councils used prisons as tools of control. If someone challenged authority, prison silenced them quietly. No martyrdom, no public outrage. Just disappearance. Shocking fact. Many political prisoners were held without trial indefinitely. They weren't meant to die quickly. They were meant to fade. Some prisoners spent decades in captivity. There are recorded cases of people being released after so long that they no longer recognized language, customs, or even basic social behavior. Prison didn't just punish bodies, it erased identities. And here's something most history classes never mention. Nobles were imprisoned too, but their experience was wildly different. A noble prisoner might be held in a tower instead of a dungeon. They could receive visitors. They might eat decent food. Some even had servants. Their prison was uncomfortable but survivable. Commoners, they got the pit. This class divide created a horrifying reality. The poorer you were, the more likely prison would kill you. Now let's talk about the psychology of it, because this is where things turn dark in a very human way. Prisoners didn't know how long they'd be held. Days, months, years, never. That uncertainty destroyed people. Modern psychology tells us that uncertainty is more damaging than pain itself. Medieval prisons weaponized it. People developed hallucinations. They spoke to walls. They lost the ability to track time. Some forgot their own names. Shocking fact, guards reported prisoners begging not for freedom, but for sentencing, even execution, just to end the waiting. Think about that. not mercy, not justice, closure, and religion once again played a twisted role. Prisoners were told that obedience and suffering brought salvation. Confession was encouraged. Silence was holy. Endurance was praised. So people endured until they couldn't. Some prisoners deliberately provoked guards just to be beaten because pain reminded them they were still alive. Others stopped speaking entirely. This is why medieval prisons were feared more than execution. Execution ended the story. Prison stretched it into something unrecognizable. And in the next chapter, we are going somewhere even darker into the physical realities of medieval prisons. Disease, filth, darkness, and why simply surviving a few weeks permanently damaged the body. Yeah, it gets worse. Let me tell you something that sounds backwards at first, but makes horrifying sense once you think about it. In medieval prisons, guilty people often survived longer than innocent ones. Yeah, I know how that sounds, but stay with me. If you were guilty, truly guilty, you usually knew why you were there. You stole something, you killed someone, you broke a law. There was a grim clarity to it. You could mentally prepare for punishment, confession, or execution. But if you were innocent, your mind had nowhere to land. You replayed every moment of your life over and over, trying to figure out what mistake you made. You waited for someone to realize the error. You convinced yourself that tomorrow, surely tomorrow, someone would come and set things right. That hope is what destroyed people. Shocking fact. Medieval jailers noticed that prisoners who believed they would be released soon deteriorated, faster than those who expected death. Hope became a slow poison. Every day that passed without release didn't just disappoint them, it rewired them. The brain started breaking under the contradiction. I don't belong here. So why am I still here? Now let's talk about confession culture. Because this is where innocent people truly lost. Medieval justice loved confessions. Confession meant closure. Confession meant order. Confession meant paperwork could be finished and authorities could move on. And prisons were designed to extract confessions without necessarily touching you. No beatings required. Isolation did the job. Shocking fact. Many medieval confessions were given after weeks of silence. Not torture. People confessed because they couldn't stand the emptiness anymore. Imagine sitting alone in darkness, weak from hunger, covered in filth, listening to distant footsteps that never stop for you. After enough time, the idea of saying anything, even a lie, feels better than continuing to exist in that void. Some prisoners confessed to crimes they didn't even understand. Witchcraft, blasphemy, treason. Things so vague they could mean anything. And once you confessed, the system suddenly woke up. Guards spoke to you. Clergy visited. Officials acknowledged your existence again. Confession was rewarded with attention. That alone was enough. Here's another shocking truth. Medieval prisons trained people to self-incriminate, not through force, but through neglect. Now let's zoom out and talk about smell. Because this detail is never talked about, and it mattered more than people realize. Medieval prisons smelled unbearable. Not bad, not unpleasant. Unlivable, human waste, rotting food, mold. stagnant water, sickness, all trapped in stone rooms with no airflow. Your brain couldn't escape it. Smell is the strongest memory trigger we have, and prisoners were steeped in it constantly. Shocking fact, some prisoners lost their sense of smell permanently, while others developed extreme nausea and vomiting that accelerated starvation. Your body rejected the environment faster than your mind did. Disease spread effortlessly. Dysentery, typhus, skin, infections, lice, rats, fleas, open wounds that never healed. And here's the part that really messes with people today. Guards didn't fear catching diseases from prisoners. They believed illness was proof of moral corruption. If you were sick, it meant God was judging you. So sick prisoners were often isolated further. Less food, less attention, more darkness. You can probably see the pattern by now. The system didn't need to kill you. It just needed to wait. Another uncomfortable fact: medieval prisons had almost no medical intervention. If you survived, it wasn't because someone helped you. It was because your body endured long enough. Some prisoners survived months, only to die days after release. Their bodies were too damaged to recover. In modern terms, they suffered from extreme malnutrition, organ failure, and psychological trauma. Yes, psychological trauma existed long before psychology had a name. Former prisoners were described as changed, empty, or unfit for normal life. They startled ice, avoided darkness, refused enclosed spaces, couldn't sleep indoors. Sound familiar? Now let's talk about the final twist in this chapter. The cruel irony of medieval justice. In some cities, being released from prison didn't mean you were free. You still owed fees. Prison fees, food fees, chain fees, cell fees, guard fees, even release fees. If you couldn't pay, you went right back inside. There are documented cases of people being released in the morning and re-imprisoned by nightfall, not for a new crime, but for the debt created by their own imprisonment. That's when prisoners truly prayed for death, because death was the only state that didn't charge interest. So, when you hear the phrase medieval justice, don't imagine fairness or order. Imagine a system that quietly crushed the poor, erased the innocent, and protected itself above all else. And remember, this wasn't hidden from society. Everyone knew, which brings us to the next chapter, because the most disturbing part isn't what happened inside medieval prisons. It's how the outside world reacted, or rather, how little it cared. Okay, now this is where medieval prisons stop being just cruel buildings and start becoming something way more disturbing. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Everyone knew what prison was like. This wasn't a secret. This wasn't hidden underground knowledge. Medieval society was fully aware that prisons were places of rot, starvation, madness, and slow death, and most people were fine with it. Let that sink in for a second. Prisons were often located right in the middle of cities, near markets, near churches, near town halls. People walked past them every day. They heard the coughing, the screaming, the begging, the prayers. Shocking fact: some prisons became so notorious that locals gave them nicknames. Not out of fear, but familiarity. They were landmarks. So why didn't anyone care? Because medieval society believed suffering was normal and often deserved, the worldview back then was brutal in its simplicity. God controlled everything. Good fortune meant divine favor. Misfortune meant divine punishment. If you were in prison, something must be wrong with you, even if no one knew what. That belief made empathy optional. Here's something that really messes with modern minds. Innocence wasn't the main concern. Order was. Authorities didn't care if the right person suffered. They cared that someone did. Punishment wasn't about justice. It was about maintaining control and reminding everyone else to behave. Prisoners became examples, and examples don't need sympathy. Now, let's talk about public indifference. Because it wasn't passive, it was trained. From childhood, people were taught that pain was instructive. That fear was useful. That mercy weakened society. Watching someone suffer wasn't cruelty, it was education. Shocking fact: children were often brought near prisons intentionally, to hear the sounds and understand the consequences of disobedience. Imagine that. Fear as curriculum. Even churches reinforced this mindset. Sermons compared prisons to hell, cells to purgatory, guards to instruments of God's will. If you suffered inside, it was framed as spiritual cleansing. So helping prisoners, that could be seen as interfering with God's plan. And yet, here's the twist. Medieval society wasn't heartless across the board. They just had rules about who deserved compassion. Debtors, maybe. Political prisoners, sometimes. The poor, rarely. Women, complicated. Foreigners, almost never. Which brings us to a truly shocking reality. Your social status mattered more than your crime. A noble accused of treason might get a private cell, better food, visitors, and negotiations. A peasant accused of theft could rot in a hole until their body gave out. Same prison, different universe. There are records of nobles complaining about prison food and having it improved. Meanwhile, common prisoners died of hunger in adjacent cells. Justice wasn't blind. It was stratified. Now let's talk about silence. Because silence was one of society's most powerful weapons. Once someone entered prison, they became socially invisible. Friends stopped visiting. Neighbors avoided association. Family members distanced themselves to protect their own reputations. Shocking fact: being imprisoned could permanently damage your family's social standing, even if you were later proven innocent. So families made impossible choices: help their loved one and risk suspicion, or abandon them and survive. Many chose survival, and the prisoner knew it. That knowledge that the world outside had moved on broke people faster than chains ever could. Some prisoners scratched messages into walls begging to be remembered, names, dates, prayers, final thoughts. Most were never read. Here's another detail that hits hard. Executions were often more merciful than prison. At least execution had an end date. At least it had witnesses. At least it acknowledged your existence one final time. Prison offered none of that. That's why some prisoners committed acts just to force execution. Confessing to worse crimes, attacking guards, blaspheming publicly. Death wasn't the punishment they feared. Oblivion was, and society let it happen because fear worked. Crime rates stayed low, not because people trusted justice, but because they feared being forgotten behind stone walls. So when you hear about medieval prisons, don't imagine a failed system. It worked exactly as intended, which raises an even darker question. If prison itself was already this unbearable, what happened when torture entered the equation? Because yes, prison was only the beginning. Next chapter, we're going somewhere much worse. Interrogation, torture, and why the line between prison and execution didn't really exist. Let me tell you something even darker than cruelty. Cruelty, at least, acknowledges you exist. What medieval prisons perfected was erasure. Once you were inside, society didn't just punish you, it slowly pretended you were never there at all. And this wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. In many medieval cities, prisoners were legally classified as socially dead. That meant you technically still breathed. But in the eyes of the law and community, you were already gone. Shocking fact, some legal systems temporarily removed a prisoner's civil identity. You couldn't own property. You couldn't testify. You couldn't make contracts. In extreme cases, your marriage could be annulled while you were still alive. You weren't just locked up, you were erased. And here's the part that hits hardest. Your absence benefited everyone else. Your debts didn't disappear. They transferred. Your land didn't sit unused. It was seized or managed. Your labor didn't stop. Someone else took your place. Life outside prison moved on smoothly without you. That's why no one rushed to get prisoners out. Now imagine knowing this while sitting in darkness. Imagine realizing that the world functions better with you gone. That realization destroyed people faster than hunger ever could. There are recorded cases of prisoners refusing release because they knew there was nothing waiting for them outside. No home, no family, no reputation, just suspicion. Freedom didn't mean safety. It meant exposure. Another shocking truth. Former prisoners were often marked, unofficially but permanently, not with tattoos or brands, but with memory. Everyone knew who had been inside. Rumors followed them. Employers avoided them. Neighbors watched them. Clergy preached at them. You could survive prison and still lose your life. And society believed this was fair. Because medieval morality didn't focus on rights, it focused on purity. Prison contaminated you, even if you were innocent. Now let's talk about something rarely mentioned. Sound. Medieval prisons were loud in the worst possible way. Chains scraping stone, rats moving through walls, moans, coughing, screams that echoed unpredictably, and then long stretches of absolute silence. That contrast messed with the brain. Shocking fact, guards intentionally allowed certain noises to travel through prisons. Screams weren't always silenced. They were allowed to echo to remind everyone what waited for them. Fear wasn't a side effect. It was a feature. Some prisoners reported that the worst moments weren't screams, but when screams stopped, silence meant someone had died, or been taken away, or been broken, and you never knew which. This constant uncertainty created something terrifying, anticipatory suffering. You suffered not just from what was happening, but from what might happen next. Modern psychology recognizes this as one of the most damaging forms of stress. Medieval prisons mastered it centuries earlier. Now here's a detail that people don't expect at all. Not all prisoners were locked away. Some were displayed. Certain prisons had barred windows facing streets. Prisoners were visible, exposed, begging through iron bars while people passed by. This wasn't mercy, it was humiliation. Shocking fact, public exposure was considered a moral corrective. Shame was supposed to reform you or destroy you. People laughed. Children pointed. Vendors mocked. Some tossed coins. Others tossed insults. Either way, you became entertainment. And if you cried, that just proved you were weak. Now think about the psychological damage of being seen, but not helped, being visible, but not valued. That kind of rejection sinks deep. Some prisoners stopped speaking entirely. Others spoke non-stop, talking to walls, rats, imaginary companions. Guards called them mad. They weren't mad. They were adapting. Here's another chilling reality. Suicide was common in medieval prisons. Despite the belief that it damned your soul, people still did it. That should tell you everything. If someone is willing to risk eternal damnation just to escape prison, the suffering inside must have felt worse than hell itself. And society responded how? By shrugging, by recording it as a moral failure, by moving on. So when we talk about medieval prisons, understand this clearly. They weren't just places of pain. They were systems of social disappearance. They taught everyone watching one simple lesson: obey or be erased. And in the next chapter, we're going to talk about the moment when prison stopped being passive and became actively violent. Because once interrogation began, survival stopped being about endurance and started being about how much pain a human body can take before the mind gives up. All right, now listen closely, because this is the moment where medieval prison stops being a place you wait and becomes a place designed to extract something from you. Up until now, prison was about breaking your spirit slowly. But once interrogation began, the goal changed. It wasn't about truth. It was about control. And pain was the language they trusted most. Shocking fact right from the start. Medieval torture was often legally regulated. This wasn't random cruelty. There were rules, manuals, procedures. Pain was bureaucratic. Here's something most people get wrong. Torture wasn't always about making you confess to a crime you committed. In many cases, torture was used to confirm what authorities already believed. If they thought you were guilty, torture was simply the step that turned suspicion into certainty. And if you survived without confessing, that didn't mean you were innocent. It often meant you were unnaturally resistant, which was suspicious on its own. See the trap? There was no winning. Now imagine this. You've already spent weeks or months in a freezing cell. You're underfed. Your body is weak. Your joints hurt constantly. Then one day, guards come for you. No explanation, no warning. You're dragged into a chamber you've only heard about through screams echoing down stone corridors. Shocking fact, many prisoners confessed before torture even began. Just from seeing the room, the ropes, the pulleys, the instruments laid out calmly like tools in a workshop. Let's talk about the most important psychological trick medieval torture used: anticipation. Pain itself is terrible, yes, but waiting for pain, that's where the mind collapses. Prisoners were often shown the instruments first, explained exactly how they worked. Sometimes the executioner would demonstrate on another prisoner within earshot. This wasn't sadism for fun. This was strategy. Fear softened people faster than force. Here's a detail that always chills people. Torture sessions were often spaced out on purpose. Authorities knew that too much pain too quickly could kill a prisoner, and death was inconvenient. A dead prisoner couldn't confess, couldn't name accomplices, couldn't justify the arrest, so torture was paced, controlled, survivable, pain with restraint. Now let's break one myth right now. Torture wasn't always violent. Some methods left no marks. Sleep deprivation, stress positions, binding joints at unnatural angles for hours, starvation paired with questioning, loud noises, complete silence. Shocking fact, psychological torture was considered cleaner and sometimes more acceptable than physical injury, especially for prisoners who might later be released. And when physical torture did happen, it wasn't always extreme devices you see in movies. Sometimes it was simple and horrifyingly effective. Suspension by the wrists behind the back, slowly dislocating shoulders, crushing fingers with wooden blocks, stretching the body just enough to tear muscles but not skin, pain without spectacle. Here's the part people rarely realize. Confession didn't always end torture. Sometimes it started a new phase. Once you confessed, you might be tortured again to name others, friends, neighbors, family, anyone. Torture multiplied suffering outward. One broken person could lead to 10 more arrests. And remember what we said earlier about religion. It played a huge role here too. Torture was framed as purification. Pain revealed truth. Pain drove out lies. Pain pleased God if it exposed evil. Some executioners genuinely believed they were doing holy work. That belief made mercy unnecessary. Now imagine being innocent in this system. Imagine knowing that the only way out is to say something that isn't true, and knowing that once you say it, you might condemn others. Shocking fact, many prisoners delayed confession not to save themselves, but to protect their families, even knowing torture would continue. That level of suffering is hard to even comprehend. And here's the darkest twist of all. People who endured torture without confessing were often executed anyway. Their silence was interpreted as defiance, or witchcraft, or possession. The system wasn't built to discover truth. It was built to confirm authority. By the time a prisoner returned to their cell after torture, they were no longer the same person. Bodies damaged, minds fractured. Some couldn't walk, some couldn't speak, some couldn't stop shaking. Prison after torture wasn't waiting anymore. It was survival in a broken body. This is why so many medieval prisoners prayed for death after interrogation. Prison alone crushed hope. Torture erased identity. After that, death didn't feel like loss. It felt like rest. And we're still not at the worst part. Because next chapter, We're going to talk about prisons that were never meant for release at all. Places where entry quietly meant execution, just stretched over time. Okay? Now we cross a line. Because not all medieval prisons were designed for release. Some of them were built with a single, silent purpose. To make sure you never walked out alive without ever officially executing you. And this is where medieval punishment becomes almost genius-level cruel. Shocking fact straight away. Certain prisons were intentionally engineered to kill slowly while maintaining plausible deniability. No execution orders, no public beheading, just time, stone, and neglect. These places were often called state prisons or royal holds, but prisoners had their own names for them, names that translated roughly to the place you enter and never return from. Once you were sent there, society already considered you dead. The paperwork just hadn't caught up yet. Let's talk design, because architecture itself became a weapon. Cells were underground, sometimes multiple levels below ground. No windows, no airflow, no drainage. When it rained, water seeped in and pooled on the floor. Prisoners stood in cold, filthy water for days. Shocking fact, trench foot and infections killed prisoners even without wounds. Skin broke down, flesh rotted, fever followed. Guards didn't intervene because sickness wasn't considered punishment. It was considered consequence. In some prisons, ceilings were intentionally low. You couldn't stand upright. You couldn't lie flat. You existed, bent, cramped, folded into pain. Over time, joints stiffened permanently. Muscles wasted. Some prisoners physically lost the ability to stand, even if released. Imagine surviving prison only to never walk normally again. Food in these prisons was symbolic. Just enough to prevent immediate death. Thin gruel, moldy bread, water that tasted of stone and decay. Shocking fact, prisoners were sometimes fed irregularly on purpose. Not every day, not on schedule. Random hunger is far more destructive than predictable starvation. Your body never adapts. Your mind never relaxes. And here's something people don't expect. Silence was enforced. Not encouraged, enforced. Some prisons punished prisoners for speaking, praying aloud, or making noise. Human voices were treated as disorder. Silence broke people faster. After weeks without speaking, some prisoners lost the ability to form sentences properly. Words came out wrong. Thoughts unraveled. Now let's talk about light, or rather, the lack of it. Total darkness wasn't just uncomfortable. It was destabilizing. Shocking fact, prisoners in prolonged darkness experienced hallucinations, time distortion, and identity loss. People forgot faces, forgot names, forgot their own age. Some forgot they were imprisoned at all. They just existed in pain without context. And here's the cruelest irony. These prisons were often justified as humane alternatives to execution. Authorities claimed they spared lives. In reality, they extended death, slowly, quietly, invisibly. Families rarely knew what happened inside. They were told their loved one was held by the state. No trial date. No updates. Sometimes no confirmation of death. Prisoners vanished into stone. There are cases where prisoners died and their bodies were left inside cells for days, weeks, sometimes longer. Other prisoners smelled death before they knew it had happened. Shocking fact, corpses were occasionally left intentionally to remind others what awaited them. Fear was cheaper than guards, and if a prisoner somehow survived years inside, they often emerged unrecognizable, emaciated, confused, unable to tolerate light or sound. Society looked at them not as survivors, but as warnings. Here's the truth that hurts the most. These prisons worked. Crime wasn't reduced because justice was fair. Crime was reduced because fear was absolute. People didn't obey laws because they trusted them. They obeyed because they knew what disappearance looked like. And remember this, medieval governments didn't need mass executions. They needed examples. These prisons created them silently. So when prisoners prayed for death in these places, it wasn't desperation, it was logic. Death meant certainty. Prison meant endless uncertainty wrapped in suffering. And next, we're going to talk about the people who ran these places. The guards, the wardens, the executioners, because understanding how ordinary humans justified doing this every day might be the most unsettling part of all. Now, let's talk about the part people almost never want to imagine, the humans who ran these prisons every single day. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Medieval prisons weren't operated by monsters. They were operated by ordinary people, men who went home at night, who ate dinner, who prayed, who kissed their children goodnight, and the system trained them to feel nothing. Shocking fact right away, most medieval prison guards were poorly paid. Socially low-status workers, they weren't respected, they weren't feared, they were disposable, and that mattered because cruelty flows downhill. Guards were given power over prisoners because it was the only power they'd ever have. And once you give someone absolute control over another human, empathy becomes optional. But here's the twist. Guards weren't expected to torture constantly. In fact, many were instructed to do as little as possible. The prison itself was the punishment. Their job was simply to maintain the environment. Darkness, hunger, isolation, neglect, that emotional distance allowed them to sleep at night. They weren't hurting prisoners. They were just not helping them. This is where normalization kicks in. After weeks, guards stopped seeing people. They saw noise, smell, maintenance problems. A coughing prisoner wasn't a human in pain. He was a disruption. A dying prisoner wasn't tragic. He was paperwork. Shocking fact, some guards gave prisoners nicknames instead of names, reducing them to traits. The screamer, the liar, the quiet one. Dehumanization wasn't cruelty. It was efficiency. Now let's talk about wardens and jailers, because they operated on a different level. Wardens weren't sadists. They were administrators. Their job was to keep order, avoid scandal, and minimize cost. Death inside prison wasn't a failure unless it caused public attention. Quiet deaths were acceptable, expected. Even records show that some wardens calculated how little food could be given without killing prisoners too fast. That's not evil in a dramatic sense. It's bureaucratic evil, and that's far more dangerous. Religion helped here too. Wardens often believed suffering corrected the soul. If a prisoner broke, it meant the system worked. If a prisoner died, it meant God decided the outcome. Responsibility evaporated. Here's another disturbing truth. Guards were discouraged from forming relationships with prisoners. Any kindness could be seen as weakness or corruption. Guards who showed mercy risked punishment themselves. So empathy wasn't just discouraged, it was dangerous. Over time, many guards developed coping mechanisms, jokes, detachment, routine. They ate while prisoners starved. They joked near cells where people cried, not because they were monsters, but because constant empathy would destroy them. And here's the darkest part. Some guards genuinely believed prisoners deserved worse, not because of crimes, but because of what prison turned them into: filthy, broken, desperate prison. Created the very behavior guards used to justify cruelty. It was a closed loop. Prison dehumanized prisoners. Dehumanization justified neglect. Neglect caused further decay, and everyone involved called it order. There are rare accounts of guards who tried to help. Sneaking food, whispering comfort, smuggling messages. Many were fired. Some were imprisoned themselves. Kindness wasn't heroic. It was dangerous. So when we ask, how could people allow this? The answer is uncomfortable, because it was normal, normalized, institutionalized, justified by law, religion, and fear. And that's what makes medieval prisons so terrifying. Not the chains, not the darkness, not even the torture. It's the fact that thousands of ordinary people participated, not with hatred, but with routine, which brings us to the final shift in this story. Because eventually, medieval society began to change how it punished people, not out of mercy, but out of efficiency and optics. Next chapter, we'll talk about why public executions slowly replaced prison suffering, and why dying in public was considered more humane than disappearing in stone. Let me say something that sounds insane at first, but made perfect sense in the medieval world. Dying in public was often seen as a mercy, not because people were kind, but because prison had proven to be too quiet, too slow, and too invisible. Society didn't suddenly become humane. It just realized that endless suffering behind walls created problems. Political problems, moral problems, and most importantly, image problems. Here's the shocking fact right away. Public executions weren't introduced to increase cruelty, they were introduced to control it. Authorities needed punishment to be visible, fast, and final. Prisons created rumors. Executions created certainty. When someone was executed publicly, everyone knew the story was over. No lingering screams behind walls, no questions, no missing people. Death had a date, a crowd, and a conclusion. And yes, for the prisoner, that mattered. Many condemned prisoners reportedly felt relief when their sentence changed from indefinite imprisonment to execution. At least now there was an end. At least now suffering had a shape. Now let's talk about why prisons started to worry authorities. Shocking fact, prisons were expensive and unpredictable. Sick prisoners spread disease. Dead prisoners created sanitation issues. Escapes embarrassed officials. Rumors of cruelty sparked unrest. In contrast, executions were cheap, controlled, and symbolic. Executions also allowed the state to reclaim narrative control. The crime was announced, the punishment explained, the moral lesson delivered, the body displayed, order restored. Prison didn't tell a story, it hid one. Religion played a huge role again. Public execution allowed confession, repentance, and final prayers. Prison often denied those rituals. From a religious perspective, death with ceremony was preferable to decay in darkness without spiritual closure. Here's a detail that surprises people. Some prisoners begged to be executed rather than returned to prison, not because they wanted death, but because prison meant endless waiting, endless uncertainty, endless humiliation. Public death gave them something prison never did: dignity. Now imagine this from society's perspective. A public execution reminded people that justice existed. A prison reminded them that the system could lose people inside it. And disappearing citizens make societies nervous. So executions became theatrical. Scaffolds, bells, crowds, sermons, final words. It was brutal, yes, but it was also organized, predictable, and in medieval logic, predictability felt humane. But here's the twist that makes this chapter unsettling. Public executions didn't replace prisons, they reframed them. Prison became the prelude, execution became the resolution. The suffering didn't disappear, it just gained an endpoint. And for those still trapped inside, executions created a strange emotion: envy. Imagine watching someone leave your cell knowing they would die that day and feeling jealous. That's how broken the system was. This shift also allowed society to pretend it had improved. Executions were visible, prisons were still horrific, but now they were temporary, or at least supposed to be. In reality, many people still died waiting. So when we say medieval punishment evolved, don't imagine progress driven by compassion. It was driven by management, optics, control, and fear of what silence behind walls might hide. Which leads us to the next chapter, because once punishment became public, something changed inside. People, crowds, curiosity, entertainment, violence stopped being hidden and started being watched. Next chapter, we're talking about why medieval suffering became a spectacle and what that says about human nature. Now here's the part that makes people really uncomfortable, because it forces a question nobody likes asking. What happens when pain is no longer hidden? In medieval Europe, once punishment moved from dark prisons to public spaces, something shifted inside society. Justice stopped being private. It became a performance, and performances attract audiences. Shocking fact right away: public executions were often scheduled like events. Notices were given, bells rang, markets adjusted their hours. People traveled from nearby villages to watch. This wasn't morbid curiosity on the edges of society. This was mainstream culture. Why? Because watching punishment reassured people. It told them the world still made sense. Crime led to suffering. Authority was in control. Order was restored. And in a deeply religious society, watching pain was framed as witnessing God's justice in action. But here's the darker layer. Repeated exposure numbed empathy. When you watch enough suffering, it stops shocking you. It starts entertaining you. Crowds laughed. They mocked. They shouted advice to executioners. Children climbed onto shoulders for a better view. Vendors sold food nearby. Death became background noise to daily life. And that didn't make people cruel overnight. It made them comfortable. Shocking fact, some executions went wrong and dragged on for hours, and the crowd stayed. Not out of horror, out of fascination. The longer it lasted, the more memorable it became. Pain stretched into spectacle. Now connect this back to prisons. When prison suffering was hidden, society didn't have to confront it. When execution suffering was visible, society learned to normalize it. Both outcomes served power, just in different ways. Here's something people rarely consider. Public executions relieved social guilt about prisons. If people believed death was swift and public, they assumed prison must be temporary and tolerable. Out of sight, out of mind. And for prisoners watching from inside cells, public executions sent a clear message. This is the best ending you'll get. That's why some prisoners behaved differently once executions became common. They confessed faster. They cooperated. They stopped resisting. The system didn't need to torture as much. Fear did the work. Now let's talk about crowd psychology for a moment. When people gather to watch punishment together, responsibility dissolves. No single person feels cruel. The crowd absorbs guilt. Violence becomes communal, not personal. Shocking fact, authorities encouraged large crowds because shared violence reduced rebellion. When everyone participated emotionally, fewer people questioned the system. You can't rebel against something you helped witness. Religion again provided justification. Sermons before executions framed the event as a lesson, not cruelty. If you felt uncomfortable, that discomfort was proof the lesson worked. If you felt entertained, that meant you understood justice. Either way, the system won. And here's the most chilling realization of all. Public executions didn't reduce violence. They taught people how to tolerate it. Watching pain trained the population to accept suffering as normal, deserved, even necessary. That acceptance echoed back into prisons. Guards grew harsher. Conditions worsened. Empathy thinned. After all, if society could cheer at death, why should a starving prisoner matter? So by the time medieval punishment reached its peak, suffering had two faces: hidden decay behind stone walls, and loud death in public squares. One erased people quietly. The other erased them loudly. Both reinforced obedience, and that leads us to the final turn of this story. Because eventually, people began asking a dangerous question, not out of kindness, but out of fear. What if this system creates monsters instead of order? Let me be clear from the start. Medieval society didn't suddenly wake up one day and decide to be compassionate. That's not how this story goes. The realization that prisons were broken came from fear, not empathy. People started noticing something disturbing. The system designed to create order was producing more chaos. Shocking fact right away. Many repeat criminals in late medieval Europe were former prisoners, not because prison rehabilitated them badly, but because it destroyed them completely. People came out angrier, more desperate, less connected to society. Prison didn't correct behavior, it sharpened it. Authorities started asking uncomfortable questions. Why were released prisoners committing worse crimes? Why were communities becoming more violent, not less? Why did fear seem to work until it didn't? Here's the part that really worried them. Prison trauma spread outward. Former prisoners didn't reintegrate quietly. They carried fear, paranoia, and brutality back into villages. Families broke down. Trust collapsed. Violence normalized. The system was creating exactly what it claimed to prevent. And then came the rebellions. Shocking fact, prisons became flashpoints for riots. Not just inside, but outside. Families protested. Crowds gathered. Rumors of cruelty sparked unrest. Authorities realized that hidden suffering didn't stay hidden forever. It leaked. At the same time, religious thinkers began shifting tone. Not all of them, but enough. Some started questioning whether endless suffering truly reflected divine justice. Was punishment meant to correct the soul, or crush it? That question mattered more than it sounds, because theology shaped law. Now, here's the irony. Prisons improved not because prisoners mattered, but because society feared the consequences of broken people. Reform wasn't about mercy. It was about containment. Basic changes began appearing. Slightly better food, scheduled meals, limited visitation, defined sentences, light, air, rules. Shocking fact, the idea of a fixed prison sentence was revolutionary. Before this, not knowing when punishment would end was the punishment itself. Giving prisoners an end date reduced desperation and rebellion. Another shift happened quietly. Torture began to lose legitimacy. Not because it was cruel, but because it was unreliable. False confessions clogged the system. Innocent people suffered. Authority looked foolish when truth kept changing. Pain stopped being efficient. And that's the key word here. Efficient. Medieval punishment didn't evolve because hearts softened. It evolved because suffering stopped producing predictable results. Here's something most people don't realize. Modern prisons didn't replace medieval prisons. They corrected their failures. Light, structure, routine, surveillance, and psychological control replaced starvation and darkness. The goal stayed the same. Control behavior. The method just got cleaner. By the late medieval period, thinkers started saying something dangerous. Maybe punishment should change people, not erase them. That idea was radical, suspicious, almost subversive. But it spread, slowly, painfully, unevenly, and prisoners felt it first. Fewer oubliettes, fewer forgotten deaths, more records, more accountability, still brutal but less invisible. And here's the final shocking truth of this chapter. Medieval prisons didn't end because they were cruel. They ended because they were ineffective. Cruelty alone is easy to justify. Failure is not. Which brings us to the final chapter. Because once society began reshaping punishment, it left behind a legacy that still affects us today. our prisons, our laws, our ideas of justice. Next chapter, we're closing this story by asking the hardest question of all. How much of medieval punishment are we still living with right now? Here's the uncomfortable truth that medieval society slowly realized, but never fully escaped. Fear works fast, but it lingers forever. Once you build a system around terror, you don't just turn it off. It seeps into habits, laws, expectations, even into how people see themselves. Shocking fact right away. Even after prison reforms began, many former practices continued quietly. Darkness, isolation, starvation-like versions of punishment didn't disappear. They were simply renamed. Discipline, order, correction. The language softened, but the intent stayed familiar. People in power noticed something unsettling. Fear didn't just control criminals, it controlled everyone. Law-abiding citizens changed how they walked, talked, gathered, and trusted each other. Communities became quieter, more obedient, and more anxious. That anxiety became useful. Authorities learned that punishment didn't need to be extreme to be effective. It just needed to be remembered. Medieval prisons had already done the hardest work. They had taught society what disappearance looked like. Even when conditions improved, the memory remained. Former prisoners carried that memory too, and here's a shocking reality. Many became the strongest enforcers of the system, not because they believed in it, but because they feared returning to it. Trauma doesn't always produce rebellion. Sometimes it produces loyalty. This is how fear reproduces itself. Another realization began spreading quietly. Humiliation was often more damaging than pain. Physical wounds healed. Shame lingered. That understanding reshaped punishment. Public exposure, records, labels, criminal identity. The medieval prison didn't die. It evolved into psychological space. People were no longer erased physically. They were erased socially. Jobs denied. Communities suspicious. Trust withheld. Sound familiar? Shocking fact, the concept of paying your debt to society didn't truly exist yet. Once marked, always marked. And that mindset survived long past the Middle Ages. And here's the most ironic part. As prisons became less brutal, society became more confident in punishment. Clean walls, rules, structure, visibility, all of it created the illusion of fairness. Pain looked organized, therefore justified. The cruelty didn't end. It became believable. This is where medieval punishment leaves its deepest scar, not in chains or dungeons, but in the idea that suffering creates order, that fear equals safety, that removing people makes society stronger. Those ideas didn't stay medieval. They followed us. And by the time the Middle Ages ended, something dangerous had already been normalized. The belief that some people must suffer so others can feel secure. Which brings us to the final chapter, the one that connects everything back to now. Because the question isn't were medieval prisons cruel. The question is, how much of that logic are we still living with today? Let me end this by asking you something honestly. After everything we've talked about, the darkness, the hunger, the torture, the disappearance, it's tempting to say, thank God that's over. We're better now, But here's the uncomfortable truth. The medieval prison didn't vanish. It evolved, the stone walls came down, the chains changed shape, the language softened, but the core idea survived, that fear is an effective way to manage people. Shocking fact right away. Many modern punishment systems still rely on isolation, uncertainty, and psychological pressure, the same tools medieval prisons perfected centuries ago. Solitary confinement, indefinite detention, social erasure. The methods are cleaner, quieter, and legal, but the impact on the human mind hasn't changed much. What medieval prisons taught the world wasn't just how to punish it, taught how to disappear people without killing them, and once a society learns that trick, it rarely forgets it. Think about how quickly people accept suffering when it's framed as necessary. Think about how easily we stop asking what happens behind walls we don't see. Medieval society did the same thing. They told themselves stories, that prisoners deserved it, that order required it, that discomfort meant safety, and those stories worked. Here's something that really sticks with me. Most medieval people never entered a prison, yet prisons shaped their behavior. Fear disciplined more effectively than guards ever could. And if that sounds familiar, it should. The most shocking realization isn't how cruel medieval prisons were. It's how familiar they feel. We still struggle with the same questions. Does punishment prevent harm or reproduce it? Does suffering create justice or just satisfy fear? And at what point does protecting society start damaging it? Medieval prisons answered those questions one way, through silence, pain, and disappearance. We answer them differently now, but not always better. And here's the final truth I want you to sit with. The people who prayed for death in medieval prisons weren't weak. They were rational. They understood something deeply human, that endless suffering without meaning is worse than an ending. When punishment loses purpose, it stops being justice. It becomes cruelty with paperwork. So the next time you hear about punishment, prisons, or deserving suffering, remember this story. Remember that once upon a time, an entire society believed fear would save them. Before you click away, let me say one last thing, not as a historian, not as a narrator, but just as another human trying to make sense of all this with you. It's easy to treat medieval prisons like a horror story with a safe ending. Dark past, bright present, lesson learned, but history rarely works that neatly. The Middle Ages didn't invent cruelty, they systemized it. And once cruelty becomes a system, it doesn't disappear. It adapts. Comma. Shocking fact, every era believes its punishment system is more humane than the last. Medieval society believed prison was more merciful than execution. Later societies believed structured prisons were more humane than dungeons. Today, we believe regulation makes suffering acceptable. Each step feels like progress until someone inside breaks. The real danger isn't chains or cells. It's distance. The farther punishment gets from our sight, the easier it becomes to justify. Medieval prisons taught that lesson perfectly. Hidden suffering is tolerable suffering. And here's the part that connects you to this story, whether you like it or not. Most people who supported medieval punishment systems were ordinary, decent people. They loved their families. They followed their faith. They thought they were on the right side of history. That's the scary part, because it means cruelty doesn't require evil people. It only requires indifference, fear, and a good enough story to explain why suffering is necessary. So when we talk about people praying for death in medieval prisons, don't imagine them as distant, broken figures. Imagine someone like you, stripped of certainty, isolated from meaning, and left waiting without an end in sight. Anyone would break. History isn't here to make us feel superior. It's here to make us careful. If this story made you uncomfortable, that's not a failure. That's history doing its job. It's asking you to look twice at systems we usually accept without thinking. And if you want more stories like this, the ones hiding behind footnotes, the ones school never really lingered on, you know what to do. Subscribe, stay curious, question the normal, because the moment suffering becomes normal, history is already repeating itself. Thanks for watching.